You're listening to the Requiem Metal Podcast. This is the Requiem Metal Podcast. If the name sounds familiar to maybe three of you, back in the early 90s, myself and Chris Dick did a death metal magazine, fanzine, called The Requiem. And I'm joined by Jason Hundy.
Hello.
You want to give us a little bit of your backstory? What's your association with metal?
Yeah, well, actually, I kind of I met Mark through Chris because he was doing the magazine with Chris as well as being his roommate, and so that's kind of how we got hooked up. And then I don't know, the years have passed, time flies, kind of thing. I know you're going to go through kind of your metal past, but Chris and Mark were always a little bit older than us, than my kind of generation. You guys are about 4 years ahead of us in high school, and we all kind of came from the same town, this Palookaville average town, college town called Mount Pleasant, Michigan. And we were kind of typically into a lot of the stuff that you guys were in before you guys got into metal. You know, your Pantera, Sepultura, Slayer, Metallica. You know, the thrash stuff was sort of playing its way out. And my first year of high school was 93, 94, so we were kind of on the verge of the new metal explosion, I guess. You know, but we were listening to a lot of Rage and Tool and things like that. And Roadrunner was starting to make some noise, I guess.
Waves, yeah,
some mainstream waves. And I remember, actually, the song that really sort of changed things for us, I remember we may have been in 8th grade or 9th grade, and Headbangers Ball used to do this thing called Into the Pit. And it was like the last half hour where they would play, it was like if you were really a diehard metalhead, you would stick around till 2:30 in the morning when they'd finally play.
Your Stuff for the Children?
Yeah, exactly. You'd finally get your real sort of stuff. And we were sitting there probably in 8th or 9th grade, and I remember Rapture off of Morbid Angel's Covenant came on. This probably 93ish, and that really scared the piss out of me. Clearly, I was sitting there watching it, kind of trying to figure out what was it about these guys? Because, Slayer was pretty intense for us at times, and we were kind of absorbing that. And Sepultura had, the sort of vocals that were a little gargly at times, but nothing like the guttural stuff that you were sort of hearing out of Dave Vincent at that time. And then we were sort of right on the verge of almost the mainstreaming of death metal at that time. Like, we almost came into it at the perfect time in high school.
The whole Columbia Earache split, and
Exactly, and like Hung from Napalm Death was pretty soon on Headbangers Ball, and that was like, we didn't know what was going on. That video, if you remember, was just so like, it was almost sped up or something, like the filming was.
Oh, they like messed with like the film rates. It was all kind of like otherworldly, and it was played dead serious. And you didn't know what
scary as
witnessing
hell.
Some kind of incantation or what at the time.
Apocalypse,
it was kind of crazy.
And then I think the song that did it for us were like we may have been shy at first around some of this stuff, but when God of Emptiness, the video came out from Morbid. That was like you say incantation, and that guy turns in like a demon. Like, we were just like, well, we're it's either we're all in now or we get out of the stuff now, because it was like the crossroads moment where I think
let your children come to me.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's something as metal people. I think all people have sort of a crossroads. Like how far is their tolerance really going to go?
Yeah. Was it just? That's kind of what this first episode is about. Is just to kind of. Let everybody know kind of where we're coming from. And I know some people just, they're into metal for purely like, they want to go out and headbang and just like kind of forget about things or whatever. But I think at least, me, Chris, and Jason we've kind of been into it more of almost like an academic, not to sound hoity-toity or anything, but
sure.
Just totally got into it, and something kind of clicked, and we never went back to just listen to the radio again. Never could do that again, I don't think.
Sure, absolutely.
I wanted to also preface that you've done a lot of writing. When me, Chris, and Jason, and a bunch of other people as well did, we were kind of the core of Eclipse magazine. That was a fanzine that ran for 7 issues, I think.
Yep.
And you were involved pretty much from maybe the second issue on, or
no,
first issue?
First issue on.
First issue on.
That was, you jump ahead a little bit, and I know we'll kind of get back into like how Europe changed our lives, European metal stuff. But yeah, jump ahead a few years, get through high school, and I've now at this point met Mark and Chris, and I think, you guys had sort of gone your separate ways for a little while. You were out in Philadelphia, and the breakup, featuring Jennifer Aniston and Vince Vaughn, but Chris wanted to sort of continue with something, and so he started from the ground up again with Eclipse, and probably 97-ish, which was my freshman year in college, and I just started as a writer, and I look back at some of the stuff I wrote right away, and I'm sure you look back at some of it, it's just putrid.
Some of the stuff I first started writing was in high school.
Yeah.
And I was never very good at English. I was just more about, I could get my thoughts out, but they weren't very refined by any means.
Well, and I think I should point out, too, is, Mark is an artist, and so Mark was always coming from you were always coming from like a more of an artist sort of standpoint.
Yeah, I did most of at the beginning of the Requiem, me and Chris did a lot of the layout, but that's where I really glommed on and started, really getting into Photoshop, and that kind of took off a lot of graphic design and comic career stuff, if you want to call it that as well.
And so Mark's almost sort of been able to sort of paint the palette for our kind of academia version of metal, if you will. He sort of gives the visual image to sort of some of the words that Chris and I kind of did. And as I think I went through a couple issues of Eclipse, I just had more and more involvement, and eventually Chris just sort of made me an editor, and then that's when, right around that time, when you kind of got re-involved. And I think
I just kind of came on as in an art editor capacity. I don't think I really did any interviews that I can remember.
I think you helped out with Catatonia and a few other things that you had some sort of
I was involved with doing like a lot of the the kind of tongue-in-cheek quotes for like the subtitles for all the interviews and stuff like that, and laying the entire magazine out, a handful of reviews. But basically, you and Chris did the lion's share of the the writing and interviews at that point.
Absolutely. And for a couple issues, I tried to be like one of the main editors, and I had to take my it's a harder job than what you think, because you're really having to like file down people's words into stuff, and like trying to like not have them lose their integrity, but at least make it readable, and sentence fragments, and things like this. So it's pretty crazy. And then you used to help me out as well, because in college I was in the broadcasting program, and I hosted a couple metal shows, and the Furnace and things like that, just at our local Central Michigan radio station. And you were also doing a lot of metal things for the local newspaper at the time, so it was like we were hitting them on all fronts, And in a strange way, like, Mark and I both worked at a record store there in town, and that record store almost kind of became like the nucleus of a kind of a northern Michigan metal community, and a lot of people would come up from Detroit and things like this. Cause, and again, you talked about us like looking at it from an academic sort of standpoint, not to, to get back into the hoity-toity thing, but I think at a certain point, probably about 97, 98, 99, I think we really had our pulse on what was sort of happening in the metal scene.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Pretty good way, and I think we've always sort of understood, I think, the underground, both intellectually and both from a fan point of view too. Like we can kind of look at it from both points of view, so I think we brought that atmosphere into the record store, and that sort of helped us sort of keep our roots. Yeah,
and it kind of dispelled the the metal myth of just like a balding guy with a jean jacket banging his head in the parking lot. I think we kind of took a little bit of the intimidation of people like getting into it. Like we weren't abrasive; we were like really welcoming to people to get into this stuff.
Absolutely, we were kind of the anti-heavy metal parking lot, if you will. And that's always sort of been, I think, a flagship of us and kind of how we've approached it. There are times when I want to scare the piss out of people with metal just for fun, but I was almost trying to kind of approach it with people when I talk about metal or when I play them metal from a point of view of how can I drag you into a world that you think you understand, but you really don't, and that's where, luckily we've been blessed with like bands like Opeth and Catatonia who can...
Well, you've been a pretty good ambassador of metal for, teaching high school. I'm sure you've definitely switched a lot of kids' focus.
I've definitely, been a propaganda artist of sorts for metal for many years, going back to the radio show and working at the record store.
Once Chris moved to Philadelphia, I think you kind of picked up the mantle of the the metal ambassador of Mount Pleasant. I was always just the kind of the more the quiet guy in the background that if somebody expressed interest, but you could you're like, oh, you like this? Well, maybe check this out. Maybe you'll dig this band, and then slowly get them entrenched into the whole scene.
I think Chris kind of was a mentor of like how to be a salesperson of metal. You know what I mean, Chris has like always been the almost like the ultimate used car salesman of metal. You know what I mean? And not in a bad way, but in a way that he could always find something to personalize it enough for you to get your foot in the door so that you'd actually,
And he's always been completely serious about it too. He's never been anything but honest about what he likes. And
absolutely. And we've given him his lumps for that too, and vice versa.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, we're all guilty of that to some degree, but
and it's sort of funny because we all kind of have our niche, markets in a way. Like we all have a sort of a shared commonality of certain metal bands that most people do. I mean, everyone likes Slayer. I mean, you're not going to hear too many people knocking Black Sabbath.
Yeah.
But you always were sort of coming from a very kind of doom angle a lot of times, especially some like the Paradise Lost.
Yeah, a little more raw angle. Chris was more a little bit polished, and I think he kind of falls somewhere in between.
Yeah, I think I was like, I'm kind of like because I'm a history teacher, I feel like I'm sort of like the Renaissance man. Like I got my hand in every cookie jar as much as possible, but sometimes my depth of knowledge in certain subgenres doesn't go as deep as some of you guys, but I think I can stretch pretty thin.
A good perspective now that you've got, you're teaching high school kids, and this is a completely new generation, so you're kind of getting their input on their take on it as well. Like bands like I'm going to totally blank on anything new, but like
like Atreyu and Job for Cowboy and stuff that like I'm looking at it and I'm trying to figure out like what this is.
Like, why don't you go listen to Terrorizer? That's where this all started.
Exactly. Have you heard At the Gates? Because pretty much every metalcore thing you're listening to, and it's sort of surprising. And that's something I think we can talk about too, is just sort of like how we've witnessed the changing of metal, like through these, through this time period.
I can kind of get to the understanding of like guys, that grew up in the early '80s with Slayer, and when death metal came along, they're like, they could see where the roots of it really came from.
But it was too much maybe for them or something,
So and then I can kind of get that old man syndrome where you're like, oh, back in my day, Entombed was, they ruled the roost. But
sure, and I almost feel like that sometimes. Like I scoff sometimes at the stuff that my kids are listening to. Like, oh, come on, But then I hear
it's
Job
with movies too.
Yeah,
so
exactly. I mean, but I hear Job for a Cowboy in it, for instance. And again, I've heard like 4 songs from the band, and a lot of my high school kids, whenever they would like make. They make like ridiculous like movies, like history movies for like projects that they do in my class. And whenever they have some intense fighting scene, they'll throw like either Carmina Burana or something very atypical, or they'll throw like Job for a Cowboy and this almost like grindcore kind of stuff. And I'm always like, what is this? And I'm always kind of highbrow about it. Like, oh, well, it can't be as good as, Napalm Death or something like this.
Yeah.
And the more I listen to it, the more I'm like, well, it works. I'm sure for them.
Well, it's better hearing, at least they're listening to that instead of pop music.
Exactly.
They're pushing it a little bit, but
exactly. And I think, coming back to where we're kind of coming from, or sort of our history of sorts, when you were coming up, you definitely came up. Talk about like the real sort of early 90s, and then I'll kind of jump in.
Well, kind of
when I come in like 94, 95.
Yeah, 89. I think we were freshmen in high school. I think I met Chris my sophomore year, end of my freshman year. And, we kind of shared we both had an interest in metal, like Slayer, Sepultura, some horrible stuff like Mordred, that like first rap metal band ever, and Death Angel, stuff like that. And we used to have a local record store that was kind of a big chain, but they had a small, this is like before any of the major like death metal or extreme metal people actually had any kind of U.S. presence. It's all imports. Mm-hmm. So we'd just be flipping through these, horrendous looking titles, and picked up, back in, I think in junior high school, I used to play Warhammer 40K. Uh-huh. That, what is it, just a
role-playing game.
Just a role-playing game, yeah. With figures or whatever. But I saw a cover that was like, hey, this is the same as the Realm of Chaos book. Mm-hmm. I'm like, well, I'm going to give this a try. And we got that thing, turned it on, and I thought something was kind of wrong with the tape at first, but
wrong speed or something.
Yeah, that was the first time I'd ever heard super, super guttural death metal vocals on Realm of Chaos. And I think after that, me and Chris were kind of, I won't speak for him, but I think that was one of the things that kind of changed us. I'm like, holy crap, what else is out there?
Oh, yeah, for sure.
So beyond that, we went and, this is like 1990. We really started getting a lot of stuff like Entombed Left Hand Path, mm-hmm. Altars of Madness, Necroticism totally blew us away. Yeah, we just at that point we'd sit in his bedroom and just listen to like Necroticism over and over and over and over and over again, and just really like there's such a mysticism to the stuff back then, because we came from a small town. This is pre-internet. We weren't quite as jaded. We didn't have as many like Metal Maniacs was the only really like heavy metal magazine at the time, but they didn't really cover much of the stuff at that point.
Yeah, because no one really knew what the European stuff was, because it was so new. I mean, people were starting to get used to like Napalm Death, which had come out like in 86, 87, and people were kind of absorbing the impact of like this initial stage of grindcore, but then Sweden enters in, and then Finland and Norway, and I mean,
and just seeing like the kind of like imagery these guys have around them, like you see. At the time, you'd see like a typical U.S. hard rock heavy metal band. You know, guys would just have like ripped up T-shirts and jeans and kind of big hair. And you see these guys from Sweden,
the Florida sweatpants.
Yeah, the jams or whatever they used to call them. But then you see like guys like Entombed, and all these guys look dead serious, black hair down to their ass, leather jackets, standing behind like a 50-foot crucifix. You're like, what is this about?
Yeah, there's definitely an aesthetic to the European thing that's
and even
totally
with Carcass, you're like, this guy looks like the Predator sitting up there like screaming on stage, you know. And there's just like a real mysticism behind all those bands that really like captured us and really never let go, and just kind of went further and further and further as we went.
What stuff did you have access to? Like in terms of live shows right away? I mean, even before maybe you guys started doing Requiem and you were doing interviews.
Chris is from the Flint area, so he actually saw Repulsion back in the day.
Did
when
he know
was
what
younger.
they were?
He always kind of brought them up, but it was always just kind of like, Repulsion. Well, we don't have any of the copies of their stuff, so he's like, yeah, they're kind of like the same kind of stuff. But,
yeah, and at that point, Relapse hadn't recorded the Repulsion stuff, had they? You know how they went back and I think they put some of the demos out. Or
I think at that point there was just Chris had like a 7-inch that had like a. I think it was just I'm not even sure what was on the cover of it. To tell you the truth, but I think he had a 7-inch or like a demo tape of that stuff because White Earp Records that actually recorded the first thing was like Chris's like metal shop that he'd go to all the time.
Gotcha.
And I think I'm probably going to be wrong on this, but I think the first real metal show, extreme metal show he went to was Deicide. No, I don't. Maybe it wasn't that. Maybe it was just Dismember in '92. But I mean, they played at a place that was like the size of. It was a really small venue, really tiny venue called Blondie's that had leaks in the ceiling and everybody was kind of an ass and it was just. I mean, it was for a like a 17, 18-year-old kid. It was kind of an intimidating place. It was like being dumped in New York with a blindfold. And you're like, what's going on in this place?
Yeah.
And that was our first live interview, I think, for our second issue. Of the Requiem, but good to backpedal just a little bit for the magazine. We'd seen a couple fanzines. We're just like, these are kind of, I think we could do this. I mean, we've got enough enthusiasm where I think we could really add something to this. And that's when I think it was our senior year of high school, or it might have been our junior year. I'm horrible with my memory, but that's when we actually started doing the Requiem magazine that went on for, I think, 7 issues, almost 8 issues.
Yeah, 7.5. Some of us are lucky enough to have seen the missing issue.
The lost issue, if anybody even remembers. But so I think as far as live shows went, that was kind of the first. And the weird thing, Unleashed used to play a lot. I think we saw them at least 3 times they played at the Capitol Theater in Flint. And we kind of got a rapport with them after a while where we'd go backstage and, Johnny was like super nice to us and like dedicate songs here and there. And I mean, we kind of, Mount Pleasant, me and Chris were kind of like the real, like the death metal guys out of that area of the state.
Sure.
Pretty much. And we kind of started, we met this guy, Jeff Savage, that was over in Big Rapids, and then a couple other guys from downstate. And we started, kind of making this little small community. And pre-internet, I mean, it was a difficult thing to get around. So,
I mean, even when I kind of got involved, even with you guys, like in '97, I mean, the internet was out, but it wasn't. It was dial-up. It was not a phenomenon at this point. You could still...
There was, like, no web presence for bands. For
exactly.
the most part. Yeah.
No web presence for bands, let alone, like, webzines or anything like of that sort of conception. And so, like, I think what's interesting, especially maybe, like, people who listen to this who are a lot younger than us, is that they're not going to... They don't have this conception of what things were like in the metal world, like, from...
Well, we should mention the whole tape trading.
I was going to say the tape trading thing. I mean,
that
that's
happened
how
in the late '80s all the way to that's people hearing Autopsy, and then that would trickle down to 15th generation copy to somebody in Sweden who would get a little bit something different out of that.
And then they would start a band just because of that. I mean, and tape trading's always been a really crucial part of metal, going back especially to like the new wave of British heavy metal stuff that because you want to talk about not being able to get access to to Swedish metal in like 1990, but imagine like going to an American record store in like 1980 and trying to get like Diamond Head or something, bizarre like that.
Fader, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And so, if you hear like, guys from Metallica or anything talking about that, Lars Ulrich, because of his, his Danish descent, was able to get access to things that a lot of other guys didn't, have access to. And that's what sort of influenced some of the initial sort of thrash sound was their access through tape trading to like a lot of this new wave of British heavy metal stuff.
I know Chris was real heavy into tape trading more than I was. I did a lot of video trading with a couple guys, but for the longest time, Chris, every couple of days he'd get a mixtape. We'd sit down and listen to that, and it's like, how do we get this on CD?
Yeah.
And that was back in the days where our only outlet to really get any of this stuff was hopefully they'd package a flyer inside of one of the CDs so you
with
could
like a
send
mail
money
order or something like that. Yeah.
Send 3 IRCs to get your CD back or whatever. But
yeah, it's a really interesting era, because now, like, to most people, the idea of a fanzine is just, it doesn't really even exist anymore. There's probably hardly any around.
Well, with the expediency of like, with web pages or any kind of blogs or news sites, you get that stuff up there immediately. You don't have to wait like, okay, let's get all this stuff packaged up, because it'd take us upwards of a year sometimes to do Requiem magazine when we were in high school.
Same with Eclipse too.
And it was like, I don't know, what was the 140 pages or something, if that. Yeah, it was a fair amount, but I mean, by the time you get all this stuff compiled now, everybody knows this news already.
Yep.
So like people like Decibel and Terrorizer, I mean, I think they're focusing more on not scooping stories, but getting like exclusive interviews, or the Hall of Fame thing is another good example of that.
Oh, sure.
And, Chris is involved with that right now. So
yeah, and it's sort of like the. You look at like a magazine like Decibel, and I think Terrorizer for us was always like the holy grail when we were coming up, and that was what we were trying to attain to do, and kind of maybe put an American sensibility on it in a way or something, and I really think Decibel has really done a fairly good job of sort of almost doing a mainstream version of what I think our approach to metal.
Yeah, I think that's Decibel. If we were still doing something today, it'd probably look more like Decibel than Terrorizer. But
Brave Words and Bloody Knuckles was always pretty decent. They were kind of up around when we were kind of coming up. Same with Unrestrained and some of those. I think they're still alive.
I still see some of those in like a Borders and stuff. Yeah, it's crazy.
Yeah, and I don't really know like how many copies they sell or what the distribution is on those, because I think it's hard times for print industry in general.
I think it's eventually
newspapers, all of that stuff. So
this is why this whole podcast is kind of our attempt to keep a foot in the door to some degree.
We're in the digital age now, baby.
Yeah, instead of I can't really offer much on giving news stories or scooping interviews or anything like that. But with this podcast, we can use whatever knowledge we have to try to throw it out there and make it entertaining. Just start a dialogue again about this kind of stuff, because it was kind of I haven't done anything with music, and boy, outside of doing some design for certain bands, as far as actually doing a magazine, it's been at least 5 or 6 years.
I think issue 7 went 2002, because it was right before I went to England for student teaching.
It's been 6 years since I've really done anything like this, and just with the expediency of podcasts, I kind of wanted to we sit around and talk about metal anyways. Why not put it on the internet?
Exactly.
See if we can get more like-minded people that are kind of get the same thing out of it that we do, and see what we can do. See if we can make a community around it.
Absolutely, and we we've always, again, we love music, we love metal, and I've always sort of approached it from a musicality standpoint, and I think you can almost talk about what we refer to as the moment of truth. The moment of truth for you was Bolt Thrower, and sitting there, and somewhere in your head you had to decide, is this it? Like, will I, do I want to shut this tape off and like throw it away, or do I want to continue to listen to it? And I think, for us, our moment of truth, we sort of decided that we're going to continue to pursue like the extreme stuff. And I think even as we've grown older, where I think, we're professionals now or whatever, you'd think that some of that would have faded away. But I think as I've gotten older, I've almost gained a better sense of,
it's a constant
histrionics or something.
Yeah, it's a constant comfort too. Like I don't know, when most people think about, a lot of people I know when they listen to music, they want something that's soothing, and they want something that just kind of like, a lot of people will listen to singer-songwriter stuff because they really get off on the lyrics or whatever. And I've never been a huge fan of lyrics, but tonality and just like anything that's kind of over the top, I've always gotten into, no matter what it is.
Sure.
I'll sit here listening to the most, ridiculously fast thing, and somehow it somehow just clicks with my body, and that's like, this is what I need to hear. It's more comfortable for me to listen to you know, like the first Nagelfar record at 2:00 in the morning when I'm doing something, then listening to something soothing that's kind of, you know, I've always, for some reason, metal just really
James Taylor makes me angry, but like Entombed sort of calms me down. It's very strange. Yeah.
And after listening to this stuff for, you know, almost 20 years or something, you just start to, you can really like lock into stuff you didn't really hear before, like subtleties, and it's
almost like you know, I always hear, I'll take a sports analogy for a second. I always hear like really, really good point guards in basketball talking about how when you're a brilliant point guard, like the game slows down for you. You almost can sort of see everything in slow motion, and you feel like you're moving at normal pace through like everybody else that are moving slowly. And I feel like, you know, with years and years of listening to like complex, you know, forms of music, whether it be jazz or metal or something like that, it's almost like the songs to me are like, even the really, really sort of fast, intense songs, they're so slowed down in a way that like I can hear like
you can hear all the subtleties of like just the single string super fast picking stuff. You can hear like, I mean, it's almost, it comes back to almost sounding like free jazz. That's why I really got into that, just because it's, when you first listen to it, it's just like cacophonous, and you're like, what is this mess?
Absolutely.
The more you listen to it, you pick out like, holy crap, this guy's doing this. They're playing around each other. They're, you know, playing just near the note, but not quite hitting the note every time. And
And
I think there can be a lot of analogies drawn between free jazz and I think extreme metal. Not necessarily in the philosophical realm, but as far as musicality.
Sure. I
like
totally
unnatural, or not contemporary, or not contemporary, but not orthodox ways of playing, you know, kind of thing. So,
and I think like you take, you know, metal as sort of a genre, but then I think, you know, you have your basic sort of jazz, for instance, which is, you know, sort of pleasant and soothing in some ways. And I think you can take your, you know, your basic metal, hair band stuff, or you know, like Metallica or Black Sabbath or Deep Purple, and, you know, stuff that's sort of friendly it's family friendly or whatever, but it doesn't push those boundaries musically. And I think that's like, especially for me, where I kept going with extreme metal, because I was always looking for like almost like the next fix, you know, like you know. And this maybe will be a good bridge for us to maybe jump into the whole European scene and how, you know, I know for us, like, and I should probably mention that, you know, whereas Mark had Chris, who will join us on other podcasts, I sort of had a friend named Jeff Kuhn, who kind of was one of the writers, you know, in Eclipse with us, and you actually still work with Jeff, and I mean, he lives in this area and stuff still. But, you know, Jeff and I were always sort of exploring things, you know. We would try and go to the record store and just dig through like the used bin and just find anything that had like a metal name or anything, and we were just looking for almost the sort of next big fix. And, you know, who could play the fastest drums but also do, you know,
like technicality,
you know. And so like, you know, you guys, as well as Jeff and I, we almost sort of jumped past a lot of the American stuff right away. It was almost like we played into that. But by the time I got into it, like 94, 95, like the American scene had almost run its course. I mean, Cannibal Corpse was on album number 4. You know, Deicide was on album number 3 or 4, and
Suffocation was probably almost defunct at that point.
And so like when people would play some of that really just sort of fast, brutal stuff, it was hard for me to deal with it at times, because it didn't have the subtleties and some of the textures as some of the European stuff did. You know?
Yeah, it was everything was way more brutal. I mean, I think the thing that might have got outside of, well, it's weird because both of our vocals are incredibly guttural. I don't know why I just didn't glom onto the other stuff. Maybe it's just.
But yet there's something warm musically to me about Bolt Thrower's like guitar sound. Like it sort of has like a basic sort of warm drive to it.
Well, I think they've got a higher dynamic range as far, if you want to get, you know, anal about it, as far as you know, the different pitch. When you listen to like, say, an old Suffocation record, when they do a blast beat, it's almost like a really narrow, low sound wave. Everything's all in the same. Absolutely. It's all kind of pushing it forward, and it doesn't have a whole lot of dynamics. But
yeah, and I mean, I loved the Scott Burns sound at first too, but like it kind of burnt me out, I think, as well. I think because I was just being exposed to so much of it so quickly, you know, and I almost like went more for like the bands like Obituary out of that scene, who were slower and
catchier,
a little catchier, not necessarily more technical or whatever, but like. That's, I think,
like technical and Obituary doing the same things.
Exactly. But, you know, and like Morbid Angel to me seemed to operate almost outside of that whole scene, because they always seem to be pushing their own bar forward, technicality-wise and extremity-wise. And you know, like, I think I initially, for years and years, and you're the same way, like, we ignored a lot of that sort of stuff, you know, Suffocation, Malevolent Creation, Deicide.
And I'm kind of glad we did, because now when there's like a lull, I go back and like, holy crap, this first Deicide record and the first 3 Suffocation records are unbelievable.
Sure.
And I think I appreciate them now. I can hear more out of them now than I could back in the day.
And I think this is, you know, and I think we're inching towards talking about the European stuff in a second, but I think one last thing before we jump into that, for me, and you can speak to your individual experience, for me, I don't know why or how, but I always put an association with a lot of the American stuff with some of the more stereotypical kind of metalhead type people that I myself didn't really want to be kind of lumped in with some of those people. And so I think there was like almost a social aspect to it too, where I wanted to, you know, like the Deicide people, and I'm being very stereotypical and cliche right here, which isn't fair to those fans, because a lot of those guys were into the same stuff I was as well. But, you know, I think to a high schooler who's sort of, you know, trying to find like an image for themselves, you know, socially or whatever, I just didn't want to be part of like the Cannibal Corpse crowd, you know, who are wearing offensive shirts just to piss people off, and is like, you know, you and I came from like fairly normal families, like, you know, like I was
small town values.
Yeah, I mean, I was like academic, you know, I mean, whatever, like, you know, I played sports. I mean, I wasn't like, I know metal can be many things for many people, but and I think for me, I didn't need it to be something where I had to rebel against the whole system, you know, or use it to.
And it wasn't necessarily even an escape. I mean, I remember having a conversation with my mom. She saw like the Dismembered Pieces EP, and she's like, "Oh my God, what is it?" She thought, you know, the typical,
"Are you okay?
Is this Satan worshiper stuff? Are you crying out for help?"
Yeah.
I was like, "No, I just really, for some reason, I really identify with this stuff and I love it." And then once I had a conversation about her and showed her like, "Hey, we're doing a magazine about it," she was like, "Okay, I trust you. Do whatever you need to do."
Sure. And I had similar experiences with my family as well. One of my uncles, who's sort of always been pretty involved in my life, who you know pretty well, Uncle John. You know, he's, you know, I'd say fairly religious, and I mean, this stuff freaked him out, like, frankly, and he just thought it was a phase, you know, that I was kind of going through. And it wasn't until I think he picked up one of the magazines that we had done. He read some of my reviews and my writing that he actually was
you guys are really onto something.
Yeah, you guys are really serious. Like, this is, you know, you guys aren't just talking about like silly stuff. And I think so much, you know, metal is, I think the thing that's driven metal for so long, and I'm probably the 5,000th person to say something like this, is that it's never been really appreciated, and it's never really kind of gotten its due musically.
Especially extreme metal. I mean, hair band stuff to some degree got a pretty good level of...
Well, it got money and it got popularity. I don't know
how many people glom onto that as much. I mean, that was just almost like background music for having a good time. I don't know how many people, like, honestly are, you know, really relish in that stuff too much without the tongue-in-cheek factor.
Exactly. I mean, I think musicality, some of that stuff will survive, you know.
And like Motley Crue is always going to be your, you know...
Sure.
Upper echelon of that stuff. But.
Yeah, and George Lynch and some of the guitar players who are out of that. I have kind of a Dokken fetish. So it's just, you know, so does Chris. So unfortunately, Mark gets tag team with that sometimes. But no, I think, you know, most of those bands are forgettable, you know. But you know, Metallica and some of that stuff that was sort of operating as a counterweight to all that stuff.
Well, look at how many of those bands, you know, Merciful Fate they've been consistently putting out records since the early 80s.
Sure. And no one paid any attention to that for a long
and almost
time.
All of the, I'd say at least 80% of the core Swedish metal bands that, you know, that came out in the 89-90 era are still putting out material 20 years later.
Sure, absolutely.
Which it's really kind of weird to even think about that. Like putting them in the same kind of thing as like, you know, hey, Hall & Oates has been around for 20 years. Like, hey, holy crap, Entombed's been around for like 22 years now.
Sure. And we were just talking about both earlier, and I mean, all those guys are in their 40s, and I mean, they're still making the same sort of.
And even look at like Slayer. I think their last record they put out was like as good as a lot of other things they've done. I mean, it was really solid.
Sure.
Those guys are pushing the envelope in age as well. But for some reason, once you get, it seems like a lot of people that get this in their blood, it never.
Exactly.
That's probably a quote right out of that Metal Headbanger's Journey.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, you know, it's because of almost, you know, it was because of not being appreciated that almost drove me to want to, like, defend it even more. You know, in a way, and sort of find further
Brothers
examples.
of Metal, as Manowar says. You know?
Exactly. And find sort of like further evidence to, you know, promote the idea that you know, metal wasn't Poison and Bon Jovi, you know, and it wasn't, you know, no offense to Judas Priest, but it wasn't that you know, that was a part of it. But there's bands like Opeth that you could show to people and be like, this is not your, you know, brother and sister's metal or your dad's metal. It's not Deep Purple. You know, it's not beer drinking in a Camaro kind of music or something. You know, it's a different sort of thing. And I think that motivation, you know, like coupled with the fact that I didn't want to be part of like the American sort of brotherhood of sort of, you know, idiot, you know, beer smashing kind of headbanging, you know, stuff.
And then, you know, speaking from our area, that was kind of the thing. You go to a metal show, and it was like a lot of guys just wanting to, you know, they had a crappy life, or had a bad day at work, and they just wanted to beat the crap out of people in a mosh pit. And, you know, me and Chris would be sitting there kind of in the back.
Yeah, I never wanted to get
taking photos and stuff like that. And you're just like, holy, you know, chill out, man. I want to watch the band play.
Exactly. I was there for the music.
And I think that's almost more of a
fight people,
European sensibility to some degree. Like, you know, you watch people, you know, like Art Ensemble, when they play in France or something, people would just be enamored and watch their every move. And they would not, people wouldn't necessarily be dancing and getting into it. They just like, it was for the experience.
Yeah, like, you know, I think a big thing for me of getting back to appreciating like American metal, because I think I went through a real big period where I was very Eurocentric for a long time. Was seeing Death live when it was in a metal fest right before they put out Sound of Perseverance, and watching, you know, Chuck Schuldiner play guitar almost like it was like a toy in his hand. I was just like, you know, and there were other people that were like, you know, smashing around into each other in the mosh pit, and I was just like, you know, how can you listen to Death? And yeah, there's some aggression there and there's some speed and stuff like that, but how can you not just stop in awe and just watch? You know, like, you know, and I was always about that. And really, I think the only, you know, even in high school, I think the only band I ever like went into the pit for was like Slayer. And that was because I knew Slayer so well that I could still hear everything that was going on. Yeah, like I knew everything that was kind of happening and stuff. And, but it's a weird thing, and I think everybody has their reasons for why they get into metal and how far they're willing to sort of take it. You know?
I think one of the first, it was in the first couple of years when me and Chris were going to shows. We saw, I think this was at, I can't remember the name of the venue. It was the Marquee. It was either the Marquee or Blondie's, but we saw Paradise Lost and Morbid Angel, and there was, besides us, there was two other people. And I was just, in a way, it sucked. As like, well, this is just reinforcing they're never going to want to tour this area again. But they played, the Creator was there too.
Oh, okay, cool.
Unbelievable lineup. And we sat there 3 feet in front of them playing the whole time. And I remember just looking at Pete Sandoval being like, how the hell can you play like that?
Yeah. Probably a pool of sweat and wobbling.
And just like, at least you had 4 people that were really into it. That's probably the only mosh pit I can remember being in. It was the 3 of us there.
Yeah. You know, and say what you want about like sort of extreme metal, especially in that time period, you know, they may not have always had the album sales, you know, save like your Morbid Angels or Obituaries or kind of these exceptions to the rule, if you will. But the people who do buy those albums are like, they're not casually buying these albums. You know, they're memorizing, they're absorbing. It's not like, you know, pop music or even like, you know, some of the alternative stuff of the last, you know, 10 years or something where, you know, you're buying it for a couple cuts. Like everyone who bought, you know, Left Hand Path or Altars of Madness from Morbid Angel or any Carcass record knew every song on that record. And like,
and I don't know if that's still I don't do a whole lot of downloading as far as music goes. I don't know if people are still just picking choice cuts off metal records or if it's more, and I don't even, usually when I listen to any metal record, I listen to the whole thing. I usually don't necessarily pull out certain songs unless we're like sitting around like, oh, you got to check this song out.
Yeah.
But it's usually like, it's a whole experience of that record.
And I think, you know, if in these podcasts, when we talk about like different eras or different scenes or something like that, I think generationally we're seeing a big shift with that where people, you know, as you know, aren't even really buying a lot of albums anymore. And I think kids don't. I don't know if like especially teenagers now who I sort of encounter on a daily basis don't have like that sort of appreciation for aesthetic anymore. Like they don't really know what album covers. Like they know they have some records because like maybe
they grew up with digital downloads.
Exactly.
That was the way you got music.
And you're talking about like a lower grade of quality of music that they don't even know that they're hearing because it's all they've sort of been used to. You know.
And if anything, like metal and jazz do not lend themselves to low bitrate music at all. Like, you can listen to a pop song and it still kind of translates well enough.
Absolutely.
But you throw on, like, I ripped when I first got iTunes, I started throwing stuff in, and I wasn't really paying attention to the bitrate. Mm-hmm. It's like a 128 bitrate Edge of Sandy song sounded like crap.
Yeah, yeah, because
like
there's
really
so much,
tinny.
it's so condensed, and so many different notes are sort of
Yeah,
happening.
and that stuff has like a big dynamic range. It's got to have a full bandwidth. If you condense that, it just sounds like turd.
Yeah, and it's really interesting to me because it seems like as technology goes, further in advance wise, especially like the digital production and like getting like everything, like even pop music. I mean,
pop music now is, even when they edit or when they actually produce it and master it, it's 4 cheap bit rates. It doesn't have as big of a dynamic range anymore.
Wow. See, I didn't know that.
I've been listening to like podcasts, and they're like, yeah, a lot of time they master it for 256 bit rate.
Wow.
When that just totally, narrows down it to nothing. Yeah.
And I think that's really interesting because, like, and not to get too far off of like metal or something like that, but when you hear like great, like, Parliament or Funkadelic records or great, like I when I think of pop music today, I think of like hip hop sounds and
Mm-hmm.
like even that's kind of gone into like dance music now, those sort of beats of like Timbaland or whatever, and it's like there's something like there's a rich warmth of bass sound and deep beats that you hear with like the 70s sort of funk music and some of that sort of stuff that you're right is sort of almost missing nowadays. Like, it's there, but it's really empty and kind of crass in a way. Mm-hmm. And I guess I had never heard that they were mastering stuff for like almost a lower quality of music.
Yeah, they really kind of just kill the dynamic range of things.
Which makes sense because, like, what's the purpose of spending a lot of money and making something sound really good when not that many people are going to buy that record, and those that do are going to immediately dump it onto their iTunes, which will immediately go onto their iPod, which will immediately be played on headphones on the treadmill or as they're walking the hallways of school classrooms.
Yeah, I mean, I really think the days of sitting in front of a stereo reading the liner art is kind of dead.
It's a lost art.
I mean, a lot of us still have, a guy we worked with at the record store that was a manager there. Mike had an unbelievable, like, 2001 dual monolith system kind of thing.
Sure.
And he got me into that, getting actually like a good dynamic range speaker. And that was a totally different experience listening. Instead of having crappy bookcase, style stereo system, hear a death metal record on a really good audiophile system is unbelievable.
Yeah.
It's a totally different experience again. So.
Absolutely. I mean, I think a lot of death metal I like to refer to as sitting on your bed kind of headphone music or something where you almost kind of close your eyes and you want to hear where these different pockets where things are sort of coming from. I think of like an Opeth record or mm-hmm. something where there's so many dynamic sounds kind of coming out of nowhere. And even Entombed and even like some of the more guttural, brutal death metal has its own sort of certain sense of dynamicism. Vader and Deicide and Suffocation. There's a lot going on there. Mm-hmm. Obviously, it's just I think upon first encounter when most people like get to death metal,
especially that stuff like Deicide. I mean, when I first heard it, I was just like, "This is boring."
It all sounds the same. Yeah.
You listen to it now, and it's really like driving and going fast forward, but it's got like a hook all the way through the whole thing.
Yeah, and it's sort of fascinating. It's just interesting how again where people go with metal, and like we decided to kind of move pretty quickly into the extreme stuff, but everybody's got their sort of rate of tolerance, if you will, and, mm-hmm. and I think for anyone that's like sort of getting into like metal and has just maybe encountered like a little bit of death metal, and they're sort of leery of the vocals and some of the subject matters. I mean, for the most part, what I think it takes is there's almost like a how-to guide, like how to listen to like death metal. It's like don't take the lyrics too seriously. B, these guys, they're doing it for fun. It's like blaming, like it's like saying Sam Raimi really believed in like the Necronomicon and like occult stuff.
It's an obvious extension for the lyrical content to be as extreme as the music.
Exactly. And there's a few nutballs in anything.
Sure.
Some of the black metal stuff has gone to pretty extreme lengths to sort of do what it does. And we're not going to get into black metal right now or anything, but you could say the same thing. There's pop music guys. Crap. Charlie Manson was hanging out with the Beach Boys.
Yeah,
so what do you if you really want to start pinpointing like death and violence and Columbine and all that stuff on like the lyrical nature of heavy metal, then I think you're walking into pretty murky territory.
And I don't think either one of us or Chris are really aggressive guys at all.
I'm pretty. I kind of consider myself very Eastern, in terms of like how I view things in terms of my calmness,
mellow, and
and like metal sort of takes some of that aggression out of me. It's almost like a relieving thing from like a long day. It kind of like calms me down a little bit. But
I remember last summer I started running a little bit, and I was listening to, what the hell is it? I think it was the last Dimmu Borgir record or something, and I was actually jogging in tune with it, and it about killed me.
Oh, yeah.
But when you can get that real, I don't know how much metal you listen to when you run, but that's like the ideal.
Mm-hmm. We actually, I coach cross country, and we try and teach the kids like sort of this quick feet mechanism. This is a completely random tangent, but like we make CDs of like certain sounds because we want ideally the kids to be running like right around 170 beats per minute. And there's a couple Metallica songs and things like that where we're just like, hey, listen just to this. Run to the drum beat, and you're running pretty much the pace you should be racing at in your 5K races and stuff like that. So
I do that with Immortal.
Yeah.
And it's just like, it's otherworldly. Your body starts to just like freak out after a while, and you become,
Exactly. It's pretty interesting. But and getting back to the kind of the tolerance thing, and maybe you can speak to this. For me, when I first heard like death metal vocals and stuff like that, like it was an adjustment, and I would say probably about two years before I heard death metal vocals as I heard everything else. Mm-hmm. Where when I got into a car and a death metal tape was in my car or something like that, and somebody riding with me would suddenly look at me strangely, I'd be like, oh, it was almost like, oh, this was like so normal for me. I didn't even notice that. Morbid Angel, Bless Are the Sick is playing right now, and it would kind of freak people out. So, again, if you're just sort of getting into it, or you're trying to get someone else into it.
There's a gestation period for sure on it, I think.
Absolutely.
I don't really remember how long it really took. I mean, there was always just that, like, well, who else is doing this? Like, something just snapped when we heard that bolt thrower that, like, these kind of vocals. So I couldn't imagine anything else fitting with the music better than this kind of vocal.
Sure. Put Queensryche vocals over top, like an Entombed record.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, it won't work, and that's the problem.
And see, that's probably a little bit off tangent as well, but when in the, I'd say mid to late 90s, when a lot of people were bring like clean vocals back in, that kind of lost me.
Yeah.
Because it seemed like it was done more so to like reach out to more people, and usually the vocalists were not that good.
Yep.
And I'm not going to pull up any exact examples here right now, but I just remember, I think there's something pure about the death metal vocal style.
Sure.
That I think just, I really am gravitated to that stuff more so than the really dynamic, crazy stuff.
Yeah.
Outside of like, Opeth, some people do it really well, but
yeah, Mastodon has sort of a different sensibility when they can switch on and off. And, I think it takes a lot of work. I think, to give credit where credit's due, anybody who sings clean and sings clean well, like whether they're metal or not, like, hey, more power to you.
Sure.
Because, some of these metal bands would just sort of go for the gold and fall right on their face, and it was almost sort of embarrassing. And I felt sort of embarrassed as like a metal fan.
Well, and it kind of sucked because there's a lot of potential in those records minus the vocals.
And I think, stuff like that would, almost kind of was a career killer for some of those bands. Yeah. They had sort of boxed their way into a corner, because if they return back to the old school style of metal, like they're going to be kind of accused of.
Yeah. I mean, there's a few, like, Paradise Lost, I think, made an obvious kind of jump.
Sure.
And, his vocals kind of progressed along the way, but there's a lot of them that really just floundered there for a long time. I know Cemetery was one of the things I can think of for sure.
Yeah,
like
Pitch Shifter, if I'm not mistaken, kind of made a really strange V-line somewhere else. And every metal band has to make a decision. I think every musician has to make a decision about integrity, especially if you're in a subgenre like death metal. Like, you might still be having to work at the post office for the next 20 years, like some of these guys in Sweden.
And like we're going to talk about in a later episode, Bolt Thrower. I mean, most of those guys have day jobs, drive cab.
Yeah, they're painters, something. Construction workers or whatever, because you're not going to make a killing. You're not going to become Metallica or Aerosmith or something out of this genre. It's a very niche market, but it has a very sort of self-contained group of fans, I think, that will keep you afloat.
Metal fans, like metal music holds on to their fans better than any other genre, I think.
Absolutely, yeah.
That's my experience with people.
I would say the same thing, So, all right, well, getting to where we sort of want to, I think, at least take this or finish up. for me, and you can sort of speak to this because you were coming into it right as the sort of European explosion was sort of happening. But I know for me, like, as soon as I kind of got out of the Roadrunner or got into the Roadrunner stuff, we encountered a couple CDs that sort of were really life changing for us at, I think, a really unique time in metal. And one was this compilation that we found for like $2. It was 10 years of Nuclear Blast, and it had a whole like laundry list of sort of European metal acts on it. And then the other thing
is that one of those Death Is Just the Beginning comics?
Kind of, but it was like 10-year anniversary, and it had an Amorphous song on it, Corellia from Corellian Isthmus, which actually on that CD it was called Corellia, but it wasn't. Corellia was actually like the 40-second intro. So for years and years, I always thought Corellia was a song, but I think it's it escapes me. Not Warrior's Path, but The Gathering or something like that was really the name of the song. But anyways, we heard Amorphous, and I was like, this is a totally different, kind of sound, than anything I'd ever heard of. And then I remember reading in this, this magazine, it was like called Livewire or something like that. It was like, in between Metal Maniacs and Hit Parader. I mean, it was
They're trying to just glom on to
or something, yeah. And they had like this little, almost like, half-page up-and-coming kind of metal acts and stuff, and they had a big write-up about Tiamat, Wild Honey. And I remember the tagline, and at the time I was into metal, but I was also like doing the typical high school thing of, I like the Doors, Led Zeppelin, Black Sabbath, Pink Floyd. I mean, I was sort of everywhere, looking at music in a lot of different places, and it said, if Pink Floyd wrote a death metal record, and I was like, I'm hooked, let's check this thing out. And of course I bought that, and that's when I went in to order Tiamat Wild Honey that Chris was working at the record store.
Okay.
And that's when Chris sort of was like, here, if you're really interested in Amorphous and Tiamat, he started handing me Relapse samplers with, other Amorphous songs on there, and that was at the time when Relapse and Nuclear Blast were together. And so Dismember was on there, and Dissection was on there, and it was like, it was like one and done. Like, I'm hooked, like, give me more of this stuff, because, with the Swedish stuff, even though it could be incredibly brutal at times, there was always this sense of melody that was there that you just
harmony to
didn't find.
I mean, even in like the first Dismember record, as like brutal and like searing as that is,
that opening riff of Like an Ever-Flowing Stream is just like,
they're almost the only thing I can relate it really to that kind of single string really fast playing is like violin sound almost, playing with with a bow. But
it was very, you're right, it was very classical in nature, in a way.
I mean, it's like a weird bastard hybrid of opera or something. I mean, that's kind of how I explained it to my mom to some degree. She's like, why do these people scream like this?
Sure.
I'm like, well, it's, how else would you emote to this kind of music?
Yeah.
It's like people, like yelling and changing different tonalities in opera according to the tone.
Yeah, absolutely. And kind of funny, I had an opera class for this master's program, which was an awful class. But, again, one of the things that always, I think, keeps people away from like things like opera is like, what the hell are they yelling about so loud?
It's melodrama. It's like, I love that kind of stuff. So it's, it's like original Star Trek, over the top.
Sure. And even that was sort of played out in some of those early Swedish bands. Like Dark Tranquillity had a song on their first record on Skydancer called Shadow Duet, where these guys are actually literally like arguing with each other in the middle of the song, start screaming back and forth. And, there's dynamics of a female singing. It's like you got your soprano, you got your your tenor and your bass, and I mean,
if you break it all down, it's really classically inspired stuff.
Absolutely. I think that's why they always say Wagner would have been a metalhead, and Beethoven would have been in Led Zeppelin, which I think was a quote from that Headbangers Journey documentary that Sam Dunn did. But so there's the European stuff really sort of set its hooks in me, and I think too, and I'll sort of admit this on the air, if you will. I think too there was a part of the European thing, and maybe you can speak to this as well. There was a part of the European thing that was appealing to me from the standpoint of I knew about it, but other people didn't. There was almost like a massively appealing thing of like,
sure, you're the insider.
Yeah,
I mean, that's...
we in America in the early 90s, mid 90s, before the internet and all this other stuff, like if you really like read up on that stuff and you knew like your Century Media back catalog, Earache back catalog, Nuclear Blast back catalog, Peaceville and all that sort of stuff, and then you encountered like American metalheads, like you could run circles around them in some ways. No offense to those guys, but like I knew Obituary and Morbid Angel and stuff, but I'm like, oh, that's old news. Let me tell you about Grave and Dismember, Unleashed, Dark Tranquillity, and Flames, At the Gates.
It could be a comfort thing. I mean, there's some people that they listen to the same 3 or 4 bands their entire life, and that's cool with them. But I always had this desire to like, I got to get more. I got to get more. I got to keep branching this thing out as big as I can.
Sure, and that's sort of, I think, where the show will sort of take us, is that we're going to look at some different things that maybe have been forgotten in time, or just sort of different niches or subgenres that really, I think, had a greater influence than people will like necessarily give them credit for. Because I think back then, I don't think extreme metal in Europe was appreciated very much by America until I'd say like the late 90s is when like there started to really be almost
there's some mild interest with that Columbia Earache deal.
Exactly. But that was almost England based in a way.
Yeah,
I mean,
that didn't perform like they thought it was going to.
Sure.
So they're just like, well, we tried.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean,
that.
England and America have always had a relationship of music going back, to the Beatles and some of that kind of stuff. And so, I guess I look at that Columbia Earache thing, and I go outside of Entombed, it was pretty much Cathedral, Carcass, Napalm Death, and Godflesh, which were all kind of, they still had like an Anglo aspect to them,
Sure.
Even though they were doing clearly different things than like the Florida or New York death metal scenes were doing, or even like the Bay Area stuff. But yeah, and I think the Columbia thing was really interesting because that was exactly at the time I got into it, and that was a big lure,
Yeah. You could buy it in. Well, I don't know how pervasive their the CDs were. If you could get them everywhere, I mean, in our town, you could get them at 3-4 record shops.
Sure,
I mean, that was huge.
I mean, the crossover with Marvel Comics. I mean, I think metal. If you read about the history, especially of the extreme stuff, it almost like there was like it was almost like the tech industry in the late 90s, early 2000s.
The big bubble.
The big bubble was sort of blowing up, and then by about 95, it just sort of burst. And they kind of refer to that as like the dead period of extreme metal or heavy metal in general. Where who was going to be your savior? Was it going to be Limp Bizkit? I mean, what was really happening at that time? And it's interesting because if you had already sort of dug your roots in the European scene, there was at least hope. At least that's the way I felt. American metal may have really sort of gone down the crapper by like 95, 96. I mean, really, Obituary wasn't really producing much that was
It just kind
relevant.
of fizzled out altogether. And the new metal thing came out, and I still to this day I wasn't really in it enough to know what people were thinking, but it was just
by that point you were too old too.
Yeah, and this is this stuff is weak. It doesn't have any compared to what's come the last 10 years. This stuff's pathetic.
Yeah, exactly. And I think like
it was the next thing to it was akin to like hair metal.
Yeah,
I think is
for you guys especially,
and it's not going to have any longevity. And unfortunately, like there's 2 decent bands I can think of out of that era: Tool and Deftones.
Yeah,
and somehow they've managed to.
And that's because I think they got lumped in.
Yeah, like and I really don't think they don't even really belong in that scene.
Exactly.
I feel bad to put them in.
Yeah, I know. To refer to Tool as a new metal band, but again, back then no one knew what to do with that whole American metal scene. I think, especially a lot of the magazines and journalists in America were really trying to save the scene by creating a scene out of nothing.
Just like, hey, these bands kind of sound alike. Let's throw them together.
And you had like a little niche thing kind of still going on with Roadrunner. I mean, Fear Factory put out a couple of decent records, Machine Head and Sepultura, right up until about Roots, was just sort of doing their thing, but it kind of all died really 96, 97, and the only place for salvation, in my opinion, that you could go was really to Europe. Because it was almost at that exact time that like, In Flames was hitting their stride, Dark Tranquillity was kind of hitting their stride. At the Gates had just put out Slaughter of the Sun or Slaughter of the Soul. So I'm thinking of something else there. And then. Unfortunately, I think the Stockholm scene was kind of in a little bit of a lull at that point.
But I think, once the Stockholm scene kind of took a nosedive, that's when Gothenburg came in and like saved the day for a while.
And black metal was sort of like hitting its
and then once that
stride.
stuff started to go down, Norway kind of came in again.
Exactly.
So there's always going to be another country to pop up there. And unfortunately, we're kind of out of Scandinavia right now. But unless they, try to jump over to Iceland or something.
Exactly. So it was just a really kind of an interesting thing that was kind of happening at that point.
So you could probably rein this in. This was supposed to be our intro episode. So if you liked any of these ramblings, please join us again. You can, if you want to give us some email comments, it's requiempodcast@gmail.com. That's REQUIEM podcast at gmail.com.
Yeah, and I think in the future we're going to be, spending some time on some of the bands that we think are pretty relevant. Like Bolt Thrower, we've already mentioned, a band like Edge of Sanity. We'll probably talk about different genre scenes like maybe the obscure version of Gothenburg. You know, I mean, we can
Yeah.
maybe mention In Flames and stuff like that, or the obscure Stockholm stuff, or
and it's going to be pretty much all across the board. I feel more comfortable in the older stuff because I'm more well versed with it, of course. But I know Chris will bring a little bit more of the new, some of the new up and coming things, into the picture. And
I'm kind of in the middle.
Well. Yeah, you're kind of in the middle as well.
You
So
know.
it's kind of the relationship here. But yeah, till next time. I'm Mark Rudolph.
I'm Jason Hundy.
Thanks for joining us.